the presentation. With that, I would welcome everybody in. My name is Peter Benson. I am the Senior Vice President of Business Services at Park Bank. Part of my role here is I get the privilege of working with our community engagement team, who really focuses on serving nonprofits in the Dane County community and helping them to meet their missions and their goals. We present these webinars to nonprofits on issues that we feel and that we hear from you are important to you. Today, I am honored to welcome Melissa Scholz to educate all of us on nonprofit advocacy. That word is just not working for me this morning. For those who don't already know her, Melissa is a go-to for nonprofits for a host of reasons. She has over 25 years of experience working with them, with the last 15 of those as the founder and principal attorney for Scholz Nonprofit Law, where Melissa and her partners focus on serving nonprofits and social entrepreneurs. Melissa also has a wealth of boots on the ground experience in the nonprofit world and public service world. In the past, she has helped start a nonprofit and served on the Dane County Board, and she currently serves on the board for Madison Public Schools Foundation and on the March for Our Lives Action Fund in Parkland, Florida. As you will see, Melissa is not only extremely knowledgeable, but she is truly passionate about helping nonprofits succeed at whatever it is their mission is. And with that, I will turn it over and say thank you to Melissa for joining, and we all look forward to hearing from you.
Great, thanks, Peter, and thanks to Park Bank for hosting this. It's an important topic, biased opinion, but I think it's really great to get the record straight for organizations. We get a lot of questions, a lot of anxious questions on this topic. So I'm happy to leave you with some parameters here. I want to give a particular shout out to Park Bank as a great partner for nonprofit organizations. Maybe I came to this realization late in the game, but I discovered it hands down during the pandemic and working on the PPP loans. They were a really great partner and have appreciated their dedication. So with that, I'm going to jump on ahead here to the presentation. So advocacy. Few things that I'm going to cover today and hope that you take away is there's different rules for different kinds of nonprofits. I'm focusing on 501c3s, which have the most limitations on them compared to 501c4s, which are called social welfare organizations. They can spend 100% of their time on lobbying and some political activity. 501c6s, which are trade associations, Chamber of Commerce, they also can do unlimited amounts of lobbying. There's lots of other types too, but C3s are what we're focusing on. Really important concept here is to understand the difference between political activity, which sometimes I like to substitute the word electoral to distinguish what is also clearly involving the political process, but what we define as lobbying. And then within lobbying, or within that concept of lobbying, it's really important to realize that that's just a part of advocacy. There's a lot of advocacy one does that would fall in the category of education, even educating candidates, which we'll get to at the end. So just get that framework in your head that some insubstantial amount of lobbying is okay for 501c3s. And we're going to talk about the IRS rules that govern this for the 501c3 status, but also flag the state and a little bit of the federal ethics rules. And finally wrap up with some hopefully practical takeaways of what you can do during election season, which feels like has become kind of permanent state of affairs, but certainly we are in one now, in case you didn't know. There we go. All right, so I already made this point. I want to just define it a little more. Political is specifically promoting, attacking, supporting, or opposing a candidate for public office. All right, keep that in mind. Lobbying is attempting to influence legislation. As I said, there's a lot that is just educating, explaining, persuading, supporting, but does not fall into the legal definition of lobbying. So within the definition of lobbying, there is direct and grassroots lobbying within what we call the 501h limits. I'll get to that. It's also important to know that ballot measures are lobbying. So even though that takes part in an election, one might think it's electoral, it's not. In fact, that's how I even came to understand how much education was needed in this field within the 501c3 world. I don't know, about 5 years ago or so, I went to a session just advocating because of my own interest in the Madison Public Schools for a referendum. And I looked around and said, why is the Madison Public School Foundation here? And where is their voice in this? And I learned that there was a transition time there, and that there was a misunderstanding, not to throw them under the table or anything, but I'm on the board now and they know I tell this story, so it's all good. But they were very cautious about what they could and couldn't do as a 501c3. And so I clarified that, and to great success, I will say, they have taken on vigorously their right as a 501c3 to advocate, and to the point where it did grow in this recent, in the 2020 election and the referendum that was on the ballot then, to actually starting an affiliated 501c4 because of the size of the campaign that they were undertaking to get the referendum passed, the funding referendum. But there's much of what they can do as an organization, and do now regularly, that is 501c3 compliant. Some of it qualifies as lobbying, some of it doesn't. So on the ballot measure, for example, there's lots of information about why the schools need funding, how the funding is going to be used, the importance of that. That's not lobbying. Using that information, telling people to vote yes on the referendum, telling, very explosive, like, support the referendum messages, that's lobbying. So just get that framework. If we have time, we can go back to that, but just wanted to point that out because I think there is a lot of misunderstanding around that. Oops, gonna go back here. The voter engagement is also another really important area to understand, and one that I see, nonprofits and that's, or 501c3s in this space a lot, is there's many opportunities for 501c3s to be involved in recruiting voters, getting people registered, educating them on the issues. Absolutely cannot seek endorsements, cannot seek party or pledges, can't send out, petitions. That's definitely crossing the line. But for 501c3s, there are ways to do voting guides, all kinds of, forums, and voter registration. So just keep that in mind. All right, now I'm going to get lawyerly on you and get into a little bit of the detail. I'm going to try to keep track of time while I go too. All right. So like I said, 501c3s can lobby. The word in the statute is insubstantial. That's as far as it goes in terms of a definition. So we go to a different section of the tax code to get some definition, which comes from 501h. So you'll hear organizations refer to having made the 501h election. That's what they're referring to. It's basically an expenditure test in which you can say, if you meet these parameters on your budget and how you spend your money, that you have met the insubstantial test. So if you don't choose the 501h election, which is, by the way, a one-time election that's made by filing a form in the tax year you want it to be effective. You never have to file it again. It stays in place, but you can revoke it. Some organizations do so little of it that they don't bother with the 501H election. Or some organizations are so large that they don't make the 501H election because that would actually limit them, because there's a cap on $1 million of expenditures. So for the organizations that are registered here today that I've seen, I would expect if any of you are lobbying or want to lobby, that you should make the 501H election. It's easier to keep track of, to know kind of what counts as lobbying. There's definitions there. There are exceptions, which I'll explain to you. There are, there's a different section of the 990 Schedule C in which you report those expenditures. And it's an expenditure test, which I think is a lot easier to report on than like a percentage of volunteer time or percentage of overall activity. So that's the difference. Don't worry if you've been lobbying and you haven't made this election, you can make it at any time. But I really don't see a downside to making that election. All right, so moving on, I'm going to go really quickly through this and we will share these slides so you all can go back to these definitions. But direct lobbying is legislation through communication with any member or employee of a legislative body. So all those bolded words are defined. So legislation is what you would expect it to be. Keep in mind for the federal 501H test, it does not include rulemaking, executive orders. It never includes like litigation or attempts to enforce existing laws. Communication is really what you would expect. Letters, emails, calls. The key part, though, is expressing a view on a specific piece of legislation. And it doesn't have to have like a bill number or be introduced yet. It's possible that you could be expressing a view on legislation that you want to have drafted or that you know you're working on. It is a gray area. I sometimes refer to this as lawyerful employment with some of the, the nuance of what counts and doesn't. But it is one of those things that once you get your head around it, I think you become a whole lot more fluid with it. So you see the example there that, specifically a bill that protects wolves is lobbying. One that's urging the Fish and Wildlife Service to keep wolves on the endangered species list is not. Member of a legislative body is both a member and their staff. As I pointed out, in terms of a referendum, it's the general public. Again, under the 501H rules, it generally does not include president, governors, executive agencies, unless you're asking them to veto like a budget bill or something specifically related to legislation. It also doesn't include zoning and school boards. So here's some examples. I think these would be fairly common sense. The direct lobbying, I think, is pretty straightforward. Then there's another category, which is a subcategory of how much lobbying you can do. So if we just roughly say that for, an organization with a budget of 500,000 can spend approximately 20% of its budget, less its fundraising expenses. I know, kind of a headache there, but on lobbying. So let's say it can spend 75,000 on lobbying. Then there's up to 25% of that can be grassroots lobbying. Grassroots lobbying is a communication with the public, expressing a view about specific legislation, and very importantly, encouraging a call or encouraging lobbying action, which we call a call to action. So here are the definitions of call to action, direct contact, like telling people, call your legislator. Even if you don't say call your legislator, but you give the address, telephone number, or a link to how to find that. Giving them a petition or a postcard or something for the recipient to contact their legislator. That's grassroots. Also, specifically identifying who will vote on it and where they stand in their position. You know, you're basically leading people to who to lobby. Just listing the sponsors of a bill doesn't count as grassroots. So there's a lot of advocacy that goes on from 501c3s that stops short of grassroots lobbying, right? It's public communications on, all right, we'll use the public school foundation example. You know, why the referendum is necessary, why the budget issues in the schools, how the money will be used, what the funding has looked like over the last few years, blah, blah, blah. If you don't say anything more than that and don't connect it to a call to action, such as make sure to vote yes, then that's grassroots lobbying. It doesn't count and you're good to go. So important distinction. There's also an important distinction. Again, this is like level 201 over 101, but there are certain communications that count as direct lobbying. So go into your kind of your bigger budget if you're communicating or not exclusively, but primarily with your members. So can answer more questions on that if needed. Very importantly, there are also a whole category of activities that are not lobbying under 501H. So discussing broad policy, social issues without mentioning legislation, preparing, distributing nonpartisan analysis and research, oftentimes are called white papers. So full, analysis of a legislative issue, pros and cons of, particular proposals, even making a proposal and advocating for that proposal. But it has to be a full analysis. Like the idea is that the reader can draw their own conclusions of maybe why you're advocating for this outcome, but there's enough information in there about the alternatives or the reasoning to lead them to their own conclusion. Again, anything that qualifies under that exception would not say vote for or call your legislator to adopt. There's also exceptions about providing technical advice, advocating for the enforcement of existing laws. That's never lobbying. What did I? Sorry, jumping ahead here. Why? Oh my gosh, sorry guys. All right. Litigation, so signing on to amicus briefs, tracking activities of legislators. Again, be careful, there's ways to do that wrong, such as highlighting those you like and putting an X through ones you don't like. That would be political activity, but it is possible to do an objective kind of comparison on a range of issues and positions taken. And volunteer time never counts. So that's really another important thing to think about when I talk about this being an expenditure test. It's, volunteer time doesn't count. So staff time organizing volunteers, communication staff time communicating with them, that counts. But when you think about the expense related to an email going out or a Facebook post, it's minuscule. So the expenditure test gives you a lot of leeway. All right, just briefly, I've mentioned political. When you take what is otherwise kind of nonpartisan analysis and start tying it to a particular candidate, or like I said, in the legislative tracking, when you highlight the good and cross out the bad, you've crossed the line. There also are ways that certain types of issue advocacy communications, depending on the timing, may be considered political. For example, if you're an organization that really has never spoken out on a topic, and then you start pounding hard on the bad decisions that have been made by the current legislature and or the governor or something, and it's October of an election year, that's likely going to be seen as political. So some of the communications really depend on the timing of them. Again, I do a whole session on that. So just wanted to flag that there are some lines there. All right, now we're really talking the stuff that, again, want to just give you an overview. My goal in this session is to free you to think about the possibilities and all the ways you safely can be involved in this and not to scare you. So just some parameters here. We have the 501H test, fairly straightforward. It's a numbers tracking. Your accountant should be very familiar with that and help you set up systems if you don't already have them. However, in Wisconsin, and most states, have another set of rules, which I'll refer to more as the ethics rules. And like in Wisconsin, they tie the need to register and report, kind of comply under these laws, to how many days you actually lobby, meaning talk to legislators, their staff, or in the case of Wisconsin, administrative teams. So I have a chart that shows you this that you can use as a cheat sheet, but there are 2 6-month periods, January 1st to June 30th, July 1st to December 31st. Within each of those 6-month periods, you can talk to a legislator or their staff as many times as you want, 16 hours a day, but only on 4 days of that 6-month period. And that includes scheduling visits, talking about why you want to get in to meet with people. And on that 5th day, you need to then register to continue to have conversations. It's not hard. There's nothing problematic about it. There's all kinds of 501c3s who are lobbying, who are registered to lobby. Some do it themselves. Some join a coalition and have the coalition, so maybe create a 501c4 or be part of paying dues to a 501c4. Maybe that's the group that lobbies and has a paid lobbyist or paid staff or consultants that help with that. So that's kind of the high level view on the Wisconsin rules. There also is a federal law that is an expenditure test, unlike Wisconsin test. So just briefly, you can read about the LDA as it's called. Importantly for Wisconsin, in addition to this test of how many days, they only regulate direct lobbying. So no grassroots lobbying regulation in Wisconsin. So all of the, tell your legislator to support public schools and reconsider the budget. All of those messages to your stakeholders are not lobbying. They don't count. Other thing to keep in mind when I'm talking about these number of days is it's only applying to persons who are paid compensation to lobby. So to the extent your volunteers are contacting people outside of, it's 4 days, that doesn't count. And there are carve-outs for contacting your own legislators and seeking grants and contracts. Here are some comparisons of what's lobbying, what's not. I'm not going to go through these, but I'm leaving it there for you as a source. By the way, this Alliance for Justice and their Boulder Advocacy materials is a fantastic source. I recommend them highly. Oftentimes, if you ask me for some cheat sheets, I will go to Boulder Advocacy and grab them rather than create anything myself. Here's another list of comparing the federal rules to the Wisconsin rules. Again, not going to go through this. I think it speaks for itself, but there are some really important distinctions. So tracking, so all of these don't count as lobbying in Wisconsin, except that first one. But the this one is often misunderstood. So while there is that's the top one here, discussing broad social policy issues, while there is that carve out under 501H, to the extent that you are meeting with a government official here in Wisconsin and giving them that education, you're likely getting in the zone of needing to count your days and register and report. All right. I'm going to stop for a second and see if there are questions in what I have covered so far before I get to the into this last section. And I see Emily's question. I will definitely share that sheet. We'll share all the slides. I have a few questions that came in advance. And so I'm going to ask, I'll answer those right now. And then if there's anything else, let me know. So what's the best way to guide inexperienced board members about what's expected of them? If we're talking about lobbying, then there's a lot of education, I agree, that needs to be done for board members. I think a lot of people confuse political and advocacy. If you're talking about board members in general and the role of being a member of a board of directors, beyond the scope of this presentation, we're actually working on bolstering our resources on our website on that topic. So I would say check back by September and hopefully we have more information for you there. Have another question about being asked to be part of a coalition, such as perhaps the Coalition Against Homelessness. That is definitely a lobbying group. That is not a problem. Your time that you spend working with them may count as lobbying, it may not. So to the extent you are in meetings and you are specifically talking about legislation that you want to put forward, you should count that time, small percentage of whatever, an hour in your day. That's a tracking system that should be set up to keep track of that. And you end up reporting that. However, if your role is to really educate them, using the Coalition Against Homelessness example, if your role is to educate them about the needs, the way homelessness has changed in the last, in the last year, what the high priority items are, what, just education, you may not be there lobbying. You may be fulfilling an educational role for them. Again, totally fine if you are there, though, talking about legislation and helping them tailor that, because you have that flexibility within your 501c3 status. It's also okay for the 501c3 to give some money to that coalition so that it can pay for a lobbyist or for someone else to do this work. Very common. That's where this, people talk about their 501h amounts. You keep track, you make sure that, you're counting up both staff time, direct expenses that you might spend on lobbying, and any kind of dues you pay to a group that is lobbying. Having said that, there of course are coalitions that do some lobbying, but also get political. That you can't do. You need to be careful about that. And if you are giving dues to an organization that does that, it has to be very explicit that, you know, your money is being used for the portion of their activities that are related to the C4. I mean, sorry, related to the lobbying activity. And then I think that's the only other question I got in advance. Let me check the Q&A here. Does it count as lobbying if you ask an elected official to make a statement in support of the work your organization does, giving a statement on the importance of preserving natural resources on Earth Day? No, it does not count as lobbying. A better way to, so that does not count as lobbying. It might, well, I guess I'll give the lawyerly, it depends. It might count as lobbying if there's a particular bill and you are teeing them up to talk about why they should, you know, the public should reach out to the legislators and tell them to support it, right? That would be grassroots lobbying. It may count as improper electoral activity if that person is running for office and has a forum that another candidate doesn't have to explicitly make themselves look good, and even worse, to mention their campaign. So there's some pitfalls there when you're dealing with elected officials, but it's very common. I mean, Earth Day is a great example where that is a topic where there's going to be certain legislators that clearly have a background on that and opinion, and that can, you know, legitimately weigh in. There's also times where public officials have been on a board of a 501c3, and in that capacity are speaking kind of individually about their activity, their role with that organization. And it is possible to do that even during an election season and not cross the line and not be talking about their candidacy. So, all right. I don't see any more questions right now, so I'm going to jump to this ways to advocate during election season, but do please put questions in Q&A if you have them. Actually, I'm going to first take a drink of water. So, sorry. All right. Forgive me if some of this is repetitive because I have mentioned it along the way, but we get a lot of questions on this, and I want to empower you to use your knowledge and very important perspective and view that you have on issues which are at the core of public policy. And so you can be a voice without crossing any lines. So candidate forums, again, League of Women Voters is a great example. The carve out there, do them right. The most important caveat on do them right is that you need to have a wide cross-section of issues that you're discussing. So for instance, done a lot of work on gun violence issues. If there are clearly candidates that are pro-regulation and those that are anti-regulation, and that's kind of all you talk about, that's not appropriate. However, there are many issues that go into gun violence prevention, ranging from funding mental health, schools, police, suicide prevention, gun, regulation, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a range of issues that may, in the end, have something to do with gun violence prevention, but are staying in the C3 zone. Always okay to be sharing information with the media about why particular legislation is important, data about your who you work with, what you know, surveys, partnering with other organizations, including C4 sometimes. We see that a lot. There are ways that you can partner, even during an election season, with a C4 around a particular topic or campaign, as long as it's around an issue and not around a candidate. And you can provide candidates with information. Again, you have to do it right. You can't be exclusive. You can't do a training on specifically like how to help particular candidates speak about your issue most effectively, like in August of an election year, right? There are times of year where that may be a safer zone, but you can always do information sessions on how to run for office. What are the, why are certain positions important? Like this, new positions about like monitoring elections, things like that. So there are general information about civic participation, democracy, importance of voting, and the importance of, or just details on particular issues that are important to your organization. All right. Educating, I think we've covered this. Definitely avoid asking candidates to sign a pledge of support. They cannot mention their campaign, they cannot fundraise. We talked about that. Then educating your clients and participants to vote. So you can always publicize the dates of voting. You can give people links. You can help people fill out registration forms. You can sit down and help people complete those forms. A little bit of caution there with the chaos that is going on in our election law area right now, but you can always give information. You can give them the hours for voting. You can give them rides to vote. Be careful, you can't show up at a polling place and give food and, look like you're bribing people to vote. That's a problem. Even if it's a bottle of water, there's problems with that in our current environment. You can give information about voter IDs. You can help people get voter IDs. And you can always share information, train your staff. You can find out about barriers, help remove them. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's a lot of work going on with primary care physicians and actually having all of them talk to their patients about whether they're registering, whether they're going to vote and whether they're registered to vote, and giving them advice to help with that. So all of that, safe zone, fair game. All right, that is what I have for today. And I am happy to take questions. And as I said, we will share the slides. And please ask me anything you want.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I am attempting to get my video back on. And for the moment, while that's not working, I want to say I appreciate all of the information that you put out there for us. You certainly gave us plenty to think about. And I do have a couple of questions based on the material you've presented that will hopefully get some discussion going here. number one, if you are a 501c3 and the IRS has identified that you have done something to fail their test limits, is there a cure period? And what can you do to bring yourself back within their,
Yeah, good question. I'll just be honest, there's so little enforcement in this area, and it's a bit of a fuzzy area, but there is a tax. Like if you fill out the Form 990 Schedule C, where you report excessive expenditures, then there is a tax that you can pay to kind of take care of that. And honestly, because I leave this to the accountants, I'm not even recalling right now if there isn't. I think there is a carryover where you do have a safe zone for the coming year within a certain percentage. That's a good question. I actually should know the answer to that offhand, and I don't, but I easily could confirm that. But yeah,
so a follow-up
there
to
is a
that.
safe zone. Go. Yeah.
It sounds like as long as you basically pay your tax, you can be brought back in. Have you ever seen the IRS actually revoke a 501c, any 501c designation for an organization?
Yes.
Okay.
But not for lobbying, for political activity, for candidate-related activity. That's where. So again, not common these days, just because of the lack of enforcement resources at the IRS level, but it does happen, and it happens because oftentimes people who are on the other side of an issue will report the organization to the IRS. So there's a constant volley of complaints going on between with the IRS. Honestly, I haven't discerned which make it to the top to actually get scrutinized. It may be that the volume of complaints they get, the notoriety, the national notoriety but then there's ones that, we know that like churches these days are just, there's some that are very blatantly involved in political, and that there's law that's prohibiting that. And yet, because of First Amendment issues, because of political issues, like the IRS just hasn't gone there for enforcement. So there's a whole range of things. But yeah, the issue is when you cross the line from advocating for a cause. Obviously, there's times where when you're doing that, you're referring to what a politician has done or not done. And that sometimes is just a factual and important part of the conversation, but that can turn inappropriately political.
Okay, thank you. Emily is wondering, how common is it for a 501c3 to hire a lobbyist for their cause? And aside from the percent of the organization's budget that can be used for lobbying, where else can you find information on the restrictions that they should be aware of?
So honestly, I don't know. I don't think it's very common. I mean, for your kind of community-based social service organization, there's many statewide groups that are working on particular causes where it's essential. They either have someone on staff, they hire a lobbyist, or it's very common that the executive director or some senior representative is involved, and maybe they consult. They get advice from a lobbying consultant who maybe helps them frame their ask, prioritize who to speak with, just help them with the strategy, but don't actually represent the organization in the halls of the legislature. So it's the whole range, and it's I think happens more than one might think. There is a fairly well developed ethics website. The link is in the slides, that has guidebooks on what you can do, like once you are a registered lobbyist, what the parameters are. There's also a list of who is registered to lobby. So once you're registered, it's for the biennium, it's for that 2-year period. And by the way, if you are a registered lobbyist, you can't make any political contributions during that 2-year period. And so you can see who is, the organizations that are registered, and that may give you a sense of kind of who is talking about what out there. And you're more likely to see some coalitions than maybe particular organizations.
Perfect, thank you. Earlier in the presentation, you answered a question coming in about educating inexperienced board members. That led me to wonder, as a board member of a couple different smaller nonprofit or community action organizations, how should a board think about how they monitor education? Do you have any suggestions about specific actions they should take or things they should do? Should there be like an advocacy committee that reviews, because the board's not doing much by way of engaging with the director or whoever's actually talking to whoever day to day. So how does a board best structure itself to understand what's going on?
Well, I think the first part is to educate oneself, right? I mean, that goes a long way, that if there is a misstep, either at the state level or the IRS level, and I will say the state level is where there's more scrutiny and risk, just because there's ability to there's more bandwidth, I think, and a connection to following up on a particular organization or communication. But there's a lot of value in having educated, being concerned, prioritizing it, and then taking action to do better, right? If there has been a misstep, the key is we got some advice, we figured out that we needed to do a better job of this, and we're moving forward. That goes a long ways for regulators. And then within that, then you ask for some benchmarks. So has the organization filed the 501H election? Should it? If so, are they reporting on the 990? How does is the accountant aware of this? Is the accountant giving them advice on that topic? Like, have they thought ahead of time about what those, how to separate those expenses during the year? So when it comes time to report, is it necessary to have an employee, timesheet tracking? Maybe it's only twice a month, a couple hours, but throw it on a spreadsheet, true it up at the end of a quarter, end of the year, get it reported out on a 990. So there's some basic, I would say, structural questions up front to just even know how much knowledge is there. Are people consciously doing this? Are they talking to legislators, showing up at hearings, thinking that they're just there to provide information? That doesn't matter in Wisconsin. Like, paid staff are at a hearing talking about a topic before a legislative group, even if they've been invited by that committee, that is a day of lobbying and counts towards this registration requirement.
Okay, so earlier you were talking about the 501H registration.
One-page form with your tax ID number, your name, and your address. I mean, very check a box.
Okay, is there any downside to registering for 501H and never actually engaging in activities that would be reported under that?
I don't think so. I mean, I guess if you're going to do that, yeah, it ebbs and flows for a lot of organizations. Some year they have no activity to report, and others they do. I think if you get caught, perhaps if you ever were in an audit or scrutiny, I think, and you were lobbying and you hadn't made the election, there may be more questions of, why hadn't you kind of come forward? I don't really see a downside, but I also know organizations that are just philosophically opposed, that just do not think that their organization should be involved in the legislative process, and think that it will taint their cause, upset their donors. There may be reasons people don't do it, but I really don't see a downside.
That's actually an excellent segue for what was going to be my final question. Have you seen any organizations that have had that very strong, we will not be involved in this stance from the board or the director, kind of engage a strategy that has allowed maybe the director to, or people in the organization, to start to participate in this? Like, have you seen anybody start to do things, and what does that look like?
Yeah, that's the story of the Madison Public School Foundation. Is I think there had been a history of really kind of wanting to stay out of the political fray, feeling like that school funding issues were one set of issues, and that this was meant for different purposes. But the way time had evolved, school funding issues had evolved, like that separation, just at least in the current board, didn't make sense anymore. So it really had to start with education. I think there's incredible misunderstanding of the fact that, first of all, 501c3s can lobby, and that referendums are lobbying. I mean, I understand the confusion, right? You think that given that referendums are voted on, those kinds of things. So it was education. I mean, took probably a year. And even then there's little baby steps, perhaps, of if we ever take a position, we're going to run it by the executive committee. We're not going to, or these are the parameters of things we would ever speak about, using the foundation as an example, like school budgets would be a topic, whereas maybe the foundation shouldn't take a position on gun legislation, or on so it may be that it's a policy of saying, here's our process for vetting issues, here's the scope in which we'll even consider making a statement. Anything outside of that, don't go there.
Okay.
So it often is baby steps.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think, especially if you're coming from a one extreme of the side saying no, never, it would take a lot of defined parameters and very clearly not only defined but enforced steps along the way in your procedures to get to that point.
Well, and it's important to know kind of who else is doing it in the field. Like, what's the implication of, if your voice isn't there, whose voice is there and is stronger. One thing I didn't say, and I just want to make sure I point out, is all the rules I've been talking about for 501c3s only apply to public charities. So private foundations unequivocally cannot lobby, and they also can't give grants to lobby. They can give grants to organizations who use it to lobby, but they can't explicitly fund lobbying, and they can't lobby themselves. So just in case that needed to be clarified.
I appreciate your insight. There is a lot of information here. And because of that, we will be making the slides from the presentation available to everybody so they can cross-reference and kind of work on their own. And I would very highly recommend that if you have questions after doing that, or even before, please feel free to reach out to Melissa and her team. They do a fantastic job. And this is what they do. They really focus on working with the nonprofit community and helping everybody work to better achieve their missions. So thank you very much, Melissa. We appreciate your time today. And thank you to all of our participants. We appreciate you spending your morning with us, or at least an hour of it. And we look forward to seeing you the next time the bank does a webinar for the nonprofit community.